Today I'm going to be going through this slideshow where blacks discriminated against in the American economy 1880 through 1966. It's this kind of something I've been researching for a while. I didn't put everything here, but most of the relevant research is here that I've been able to find. First off, why is it important? As you can see with these images, I'm a big science fan. My goal in life is basically to be like Rick from Rick and Morty, if you didn't know. But basically, history is interesting. Racial differences are interesting. Both of these are facts. Historic revisionism based on proper data is interesting, also a fact. And knowledge is good, which is a little more subjective, but I think it's pretty factual. First, obviously, we need to see if there was an income gap in 1880. And this is usually kind of assumed, like most of the papers that I looked at for this research kind of assumed there was a wealth gap or an income gap to be, explained by different factors. But actually, there kind of wasn't one. If you look at specifically southern rural income, and specifically from labor. So there's these, if you see like that table, there's a bunch of different categories. So there's rural total income, which wouldn't count like that would count like savings and a bunch of different stuff, or like other jobs you get. And then southern total income, that's including basically like, everything. So it include like if you put money in the bank and you get interest and all that stuff. National total income, that's instead of just the South, obviously it's the entire country. I think like within the paper they say they didn't include some states because there was just no data, and they didn't include Washington D.C. I'm pretty sure, but it's pretty much the entire national income. And when you look at that, if you don't care about the per capita income, you care about the average worker income. That's adjusting for the portion of population that's above age 15. And by the way, like the note, I think it's note E. They say that they tried doing the same calculation with people under the age of 10. Or people over the age of 10 instead of over the age of 15. It doesn't really change anything, so we're just going to focus on over the age of 15. And for national total income, it's 0.37, which would indicate that black people made around 1/3 as much as white people over a given time frame. But there's two issues with that, right? Is that it's not counting, it's counting things that you wouldn't really care about when you're looking at wage discrimination. Because obviously, like this question, it's only about discrimination by employers. So we don't care about like their returns and investments, like when they go into the bank or something, or stuff like that. We don't care about that. And also, most black people were in the South, and people in the South on average are poorer. Not so much like before the Civil War, but after the Civil War. There's a good paper. I obviously I didn't include it here because it's kind of irrelevant. By Fogel and Enderman, which are the guys who made the 1974 book Time on the Cross, which is about slaves and stuff, which is kind of interesting. Where like they proved that basically before the Civil War, like there wasn't much of a divide, but after the Civil War, people in the South made a lot less money than people in the North, even if you specifically look at white people. So both of these things we don't want. So ignore the national total income thing, right? You only want to look at southern. Rural labor income and southern rural total income, and I guess southern total income. But the issue with southern total income is that it looks at cities, and most black people did not live in cities. So, and obviously people in cities make more. So we don't want to look at that one either. So when you look at the labor income, right, it's 0.89. So basically there's not much of a difference, just 10 for every single dollar that a white person makes, black people make 89 cents. And again, that's not controlling for like IQ and stuff like that, which would obviously be important. And it's not totally controlling for location, only whether or not something is rural, right? So like I believe this paper used the census qualifications. So that would be 2,500 people or more within a given area. That would count as an urban area. So like if an area has 2,499 people, and then you compare it to an area that has 20 people, then they would both count as rural. So it's not totally controlling for the type of place that people are living in. And when you control for that, presumably, right, it would mostly go away. Which anyway, right, you can see there's basically no difference. When you look at total income, though, there's a 30% difference, right? 0.69 is the ratio. But that's because it's counting things like savings and all that stuff, which we don't want to count. We only want to count labor income, right? Because that's how much they're paid by their employer. So so you have to ask why this is the case, right? Because the traditional explanation for the black-white income gap today is that there's IQ differences, right? And Kierkegaard 2017 has a good paper on that. And I have a sources tab at the end of this, so when I'm done with the video, like, you guys can see what Kierkegaard 27 actually corresponds to, like, in terms of the name of the paper and all that stuff. But it's a analysis of 5 different large data sets, like the National Longitudinal Study of Youth, both the 79 and 97 one. So, and then, the ad health and, all that kind of stuff. So big data sets he studies there. It sees what happens when you control for IQ. And basically, and I think in 4 out of the 5 of them, the difference goes away. And in one of them, it's like a very tiny difference still remains after controlling for IQ. But anyway, and this is the case not just between races, but within races too, right? Estrenze, 2007, however you pronounce his name, has a meta-analysis on IQ as it relates to income. And, well, it's technically on income, education, and occupation, but we only really care about income in this case. And I believe he finds a correlation around 0.3 or 0.4. And then, obviously, seen in Murray, 1994, that's a bell curve, a great book. Murray, 1998, that's a book that Charles Murray wrote after the bell curve, where he analyzed the same data set, the National Longitudinal Study of Youth, 1979. And he basically grouped them into different categories and saw how much each person earned. It's kind of hard to summarize, but it's a very good book. This relationship completely explains the black-white income differences, right? Like I said. But IQ doesn't influence every job equally, right? Like, even in the bell curve, they didn't prove this. But their thesis, they didn't prove it empirically. I mean, but their thesis was that as jobs got more complex during the 20th century, right, people stopped farming and became different kinds of professionals or whatever in higher amounts. So IQ would matter more for income, and they made the claim, right, that farmers specifically would not benefit much from IQ, which, again, they didn't prove it, but I'm just saying that was the claim they made. And there is actually one paper that looked at IQ directly. You can see it here, Perrin, Schreiner, 1990. They have this table where it's kind of hard to interpret because they use the Poisson, Poisson regression. So it's not really interpretable numbers. But if there's a asterisk by it, that means it's insignificant. And if there's a minus sign before it, obviously it means it's negative relationship. But there's no minus sign, it's positive. So just interpret it that way, I guess. If you want to pay attention to the last 2 columns, right, farm worker and farm operator. And farm operator, as I understand, is someone who actually oversees the farm. Farm worker is someone who works in a farm, and that's both kinds of workers that work in a farm, basically, right? And for farm worker, it's negative, right, negative 0.0786, and then for farm operator, it's insignificant and only very slightly positive. So basically, there's either a negative or no effect from IQ, right? Whereas for the other workers, for the most part, it's always positive, except for lower white collar, but that's insignificant. So, but obviously, it's only one study. I believe their sample size is only a couple thousand. But so I did find a replication, and I didn't mention this, but on the previous slide, the study was from 1990, but it used data from I think 1981. So it's a little bit old, but I couldn't find any newer studies using only IQ. And in fact, that's the only study I could find using IQ. But then there's a replication from 1979, what was published in 1980, but it was carried out in 1979 by the World Bank. And basically, they looked at different. I think it was it says here 37 data sets from 18 different studies and 13 different underdeveloped countries. So they did not look at America. The previous study, they looked at America. but they didn't, and that's actually a good thing, right? Because we're using data from 1880 to analyze the wage gap. So so since America is so much more technologically advanced, farming is so different in the 1980s than it was in the 1880s, right? But in the you'd expect, right, in the underdeveloped countries, they're not as modernized as America is now, so they're more comparable to 19th century America. And basically, what this meta-analysis found from these 37 different sets of data was that for if you have 4 more years of primary education, you get around 1 more standard deviation of productivity from your farm, which corresponds to around, I think it was 7 to 8% more production per year, which that's significant, but it's not complete. But remember, like before, the difference between blacks and whites is around 10%, right? So that would be about what you're finding here. And obviously that was earnings. This is productivity. But since back then most of the we were only seeing earnings from the farm, right? This would roughly reflect that. And what's more interesting is they looked at developed versus modernized versus unmodernized countries, right? Where in there are some countries where they're basically farming like people in like the 1500s, and some countries where they're basically farming like modern, Western countries. So when you compare the countries where they're like, unga bungang, right, which is more similar to what you'd expect in the 19th century, America, it's only 1/10 of a standard deviation, which I believe was like 1.5%. It's kind of hard to read these graphs because they're, it's so zoomed out, but you get the picture. It's like 1 or 2% difference, so it's pretty much non-significant. So basically, in the previous slide, right, in the previous 2 slides, right, there's just the reason in 1880 that there was no wage gap is probably because the differences between the races and IQ, right, probably didn't matter much for in a specific a kind of job that we were studying, right? I guess that that makes sense, right? But then Robert Higgs kind of expanded this a little bit further. He's a pretty cool research man. And now he mostly writes about like libertarian history stuff. But in the 70s and 80s, he wrote a lot about black-white wage discrimination stuff. But his first paper from 1972 basically analyzed a national survey of different farms all over the South. And the table is kind of hard to read, but if you look at the bottom, the unweighted means of, and then you look at the column, which is ratio 1 divided by 2, right? Which is the white wage divided by the black wage. And you get 1.09, which means that white people earned around 9% more, which is, what we found in 1880 pretty much. And this is for, it says on the top, 1898 through 1899. And then when you look at wages per day as opposed to, the first part of the table looks at wages per day in current dollars without board ordinary labor, right? So that's during most of the year. But then the second half of the table looks at the difference during like a harvest labor, right? So that would be like what is it, like the fall or something, and basically the difference between those, again, last column, ratio 3 divided by 4, it's 1.08, so they earn 8% more. So not a significant difference. So basically, right, what we found is the same thing as in 1880, right? White people earned around 8 to 9% more. And then he also, I have this in a bullet points. There's no like tables or anything on paper, so and it would have been ugly to just post like a wall of text, so I didn't bother with that. So it's the second bullet point. The Bureau of Labor in North Carolina in 1887 asked the question, is there any difference in average wages paid to white and colored laborers? And most people said no. I believe the actual statistic is like 91% of respondents, which would be like landlords, like the people who own the land or people that work alongside the black people, right? I believe it was only white people were able to answer the question. And I think in 90-something% said no, right? So, pretty, what they found is that most people did not perceive like such a difference in blacks and whites back then. And then, so that's like all the farm stuff. But then he also kind of moved us to different occupations where you would expect intelligence to matter, but you don't really have to control for intelligence, right? Because when you look at his analysis, Higgs 1977, that's the second table I have posted here. He looks at people working the same jobs, right? And he looks at their employment contracts. So in 1900s, there were around 77 unskilled occupation contracts that he was able to find, right? In which, both blacks and whites were, in the same job. And what he found is that of those 77, 57 paid blacks more or the same amount as whites, and then 20 of them paid whites more. And then when you look at the skilled occupations, it's different, right? Because, and you'd expect this because among skilled occupations, their IQ matters more, and also there's more of a distribution. So, and what he found is that the majority paid whites more, but still around, what would this be, like 1/3 paid blacks the same or more. And then in 1909, it was, roughly the same, right? Around, 1/3 paid blacks more in skilled occupation, more the same in skilled occupations, and then and 2/3 paid them less. Then in unskilled, it was, again, roughly the same, where roughly 3/4 were paid the same or more, right? So that's pretty, good evidence, I'd say, within, the same occupations. And then he updated this, and again, that's early 20th century, but then he updated this to data from 1936 and 1937. And this, table 1.3 here, from Higgs 1989. I did not include a page number because obviously you can see it on the page. This is from the A Question of Discrimination, which is a book. It's a compilation of, I think, 11 or 12 essays, and Higgs wrote the first one, so he's the first chapter. And I'd say it's an okay book, but there's no, like, you can't get it online, and it's kind of expensive. But what he found is that, again, it's kind of hard to see, but if you just look at all of the United States for 1936, around 16% paid whites more, and the rest paid the blacks the same or more, right? So only 16% discriminated at most, but obviously not all of this difference would be discrimination, right? And then for 1937, roughly the same thing, 15%. So, and then there's another paper by Allison and Kaufman, 2001, for sharecroppers in Georgia, right? So this is, again, back to, farm stuff. And again, what he finds is that black people make very slightly less. But then in like all plantations, I mean not plantations, in all farms. But then when you look at specifically integrated farms, black people actually make slightly less, right? Median sharecropper income $239 versus $221, right? But again, neither of these are significant. You can see the 95% confidence interval intersects both, right? So it's the p-value is under 0.05. But there is actually one paper I found which claimed that there's a racial difference even when you control for a bunch of stuff, and this is from 1905 through 07. They found data from a census of teachers, I believe. And I'll just read what they said. The interpretation of the coefficients on college and normal school education, first grade certification in rural counties, is straightforward. Marginal returns in college education were 3 times larger for white teachers as for black counterparts. The marginal returns to black normal school graduates were 60% of their returns to white normal school graduates. The marginal returns to black teachers for first grade certification were 80% of the returns of white teachers. And this is from the Hansen and Hansen 2005. So they didn't really explain the terms in here, right? So I have to explain. So the first grade certification and second grade and third grade certification, those are whenever teachers register to become teachers in Virginia. Obviously, they don't do this anymore, but in Virginia and most of the South, I believe, at the time, they had to pass an exam, right? And it seemed to be a pretty easy exam. Maybe it was G-loaded, probably very little though, because it seems like it seems pretty to have had very high pass rates. But what they find is that, and then also obviously education, right? So that's just, the number of years you've been in school, and, college, high school, whatever. So what they find is that for black people, getting more education matters less in terms of like their earnings. And same thing with first, second, and third grade certification. Well, they didn't find that specifically. They found that, well, actually, yeah, they did. Sorry, I'm kind of confusing myself here. But yeah, so they found that the examination and the education stuff did not matter as much for black people, as in it didn't increase the earnings by the same amount. But still, they found that it explained around 2/3 to 3/4 of the variance, right? So I think that's pretty significant. But either way, it probably would have explained all of it if their measure of IQ were better, right? And they didn't specifically try to measure for IQ, but they measured for education. And usually, education would be a good enough measure for IQ. I said earlier, right? It correlates at around 0.7. And number of years completed of education and IQ correlate at around 0.7. But the issue is that black college students are not as intelligent as white college students, and their black colleges seem not to have been as selective. And obviously today this would be due to affirmative action, but even before affirmative action, schools did this. Where I had this passage there's like dozens of studies on this, and the book I have posted here, The Testing of Negro Intelligence by Audrey Shuey, I believe it's from 1966, is a very good book. It has an entire chapter that's, I think, like 50 pages long on this, where it reviews dozens of studies, and it finds that, yeah, black people were at around the 13th percentile of white college students, right? So that's around 1 standard deviation, and maybe like 1.1, 1.2 standard deviations lower, which is around the same as, in the normal population. But anyway, I have this passage from Calver, 1933, which is a study of over 2,000, maybe it's even 3,000 students attending, freshmen attending, I believe it's Fisk University, which is a traditionally black school. In it says 1933, but I think they did the testing in 1928. And in their conclusion, it says, there is a serious lack of selectivity in Negro colleges as shown by heterogeneity of their student bodies. This dissimilarity is seen in the scholastic aptitude of the students. Although there is a consistent and pronounced difference in the median scores made by students of different colleges, particularly every grade of intelligence is represented in each college, some of the brightest students being found in many of the colleges having the lowest average scores, and so the dullest being found in those having the highest average scores. Our data also show that students who have had academic failures are represented in large numbers in most of the colleges, along with those who have succeeded academically. Right, so basically, there's just not really much selectivity in colleges, at least according to this study. And the study, it says in the last bullet note, found an average IQ of 76 for black college students. This is from the freshman scholastic aptitude test, which I don't think it's used anymore, but it was pretty popular from the 1920s to the 1960s. And basically, you would give it to freshmen. It was supposed to predict the grades, but it doesn't really do that. It's mostly just an IQ test. And so this is 75/6 IQ compared to the average, the standardization test group, which would have been mostly white people. So basically what this means is that I have 24 IQ less than the average white person, and that's a freshman. But the SD in this test is 23. I know it's from a different study. I don't think I included in the sources or anything, but in the standardization, I think found the same thing, where the standard deviation is around 23 to 25. Or, sorry, 22 to 25. I put it at 23 because I think that's the average. One meta-analysis I read found. And so basically what this means is, again, they have around 1 standard deviation less. So that would be an IQ of around 85 in normal terms compared to an average IQ of 100. So basically what's happening here, right, is that black people get into college easier and then pass easier with lower IQs. So than whites. So when you control for education, it's more selective for whites, right? So so the reason it's less predictive of earnings for blacks is theoretically, that's what I believe, is because for whites their IQ is reflected more in their education, and for blacks, at least back then, and probably still today, right, because of affirmative action. But anyway, there's in 1966, there's the final year. There's one more study I have here after this, but this is the last simple one. It's Leonard 1984. Literally, all he did was just analyze the census's survey of manufacturers. This wasn't the goal of his study, but he still included this data, which was nice of him. And the census of manufacturers, I think it started in like the 1880s, and I'm pretty sure it still exists today. Every couple decades. I don't think it's every decade like the normal census. It's every couple decades. They survey every single manufacturing employer, right? So pretty much every single factory, every single, a bunch of different stuff, right? And they found this that the average black man was earned 0.69 times as much as the average white man, right? So black people earned 31% less, but also were 32% less productive, right? 0.68 times as productive. And there's the end of this study is like millions, right? Because it's every single manufacturing employee. It's pretty trustworthy. And then I titled this slide "The Most Interesting / Best Study," this definitely is the most interesting. I don't know if it's the best, but it's Millenstein in 2016. Basically, what they did is they looked in the 1910 census and found, thousands of black families in which the children were labeled as different races, right? Because back then, they would label black people as either black or mulatto, right? And if you're black, you had dark skin. If you're mulatto, technically it means you're mixed, but really it probably just meant that they were lighter skinned, right? And then they tried to find these same people, right, using like a bunch of different things, mostly just their first and last name, right, but also date of birth and stuff like that. And they've located them in the 1940 census, right? So they were children in 1910, but then they were obviously adults in 1940 because that's how aging works. And they found no, sorry, I said n equals 12,000. I think that's for the original siblings. I don't. It says they match around 1/3 of them, right? So you expect the n to be around 4,000. And yeah, actually, yeah, you can see in table 10 observations. There's 4,000 of them. So yeah, but yeah, so yeah, I'm right. It's around 1/3. And those who were labeled as mulattoes as children were compared to the siblings who weren't, right? In 1940, there was no longer mulatto and black category. It was just old black or old white, right? So basically what they found is that children who had lighter skin than their siblings earned the exact same, or not exact the same. I think the difference is like 1%, but it wasn't significant when you looked within the same family, right? So obviously, right, like when you do most of these studies, and this goes back to like the 1910s or maybe even before that, black people with lighter skin earned more, had higher educations, had higher IQs. There's a good study by Richard Lynn from the 1980s where he estimated the average that skin color correlates at 0.31 with IQ, I believe, or maybe it was 0.21. Within black people, and that's because obviously they have more white admixture. But when you look at siblings, obviously it's just random genetic stuff, like it's random genetic mincing, and obviously there's like some chance, right? Like maybe they have different parents but live in their same household, blah 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 blah, right? But still, most of the variance in their IQ, for example, would not occur within families, right? Even because they had the same exact white admixture. It just so happens that one of them randomly had whiter skin because of some genetic stuff, or not by genetic stuff. I mean like genetic mixing, right? Because obviously you get half your mother's, half your father's genes, so he just inherited more white skin genes, I guess. But then what's more, right, so basically there's no colorism or whatever that people talk about, right, because most of the variants are explained within families. But then what's more interesting is they check people who were labeled as mulattoes as children and then were labeled white as adults, right? So essentially what that means is they passed as white. So people couldn't discriminate against them, obviously, right, because they looked white and probably sounded white. Otherwise, the census people wouldn't have labeled them as white. And they found around 300 of these. You can see at the table, 293 observations. And basically, what they found is that those who passed as white earned more than their siblings who didn't. But the issue with this is that the p-values were terrible. So you can see on the right side of this, between siblings, for the white in 1940, parentheses passed, you can see in column 5 It says that there is a 0.054. Again, this is Poisson regression, so it's not really meaningful, but just pay attention to the asterisks and the whether or not it's positive or negative. And they found a very small positive effect, but it was not significant at all. And keep in mind, look at the bottom of the table. It says that there's, and bottom table, I mean bottom of the notes, it says that one asterisk is p of 0.10. That's useless. We don't care about one asterisk. We care about two asterisks or preferably three asterisks, right? Because two asterisks is normal significance 0.05. Three asterisks is 0.01. So for the fifth model, it was not significant at all. White in 1940 did not matter in income. Years of schooling did matter, though, at p-value of 0.01, right? You can see in the row just below that. But then using the sixth model, and I don't know the difference between these models, right? They're probably just like random stuff that researchers like. But anyway, so White in 1940 actually had a negative effect on income with two asterisks or 0.05. So it's not really something that you'd care about, right? But it is something that that matters, right? And then they found the same thing. White 1940 x years of schooling. So that's 0.065, and this was positive at 0.05. So not exactly something you care about. What this is is basically the effect that being white in passing as white in 1940 had on the effect that years of schooling had on your income, right? So obviously, if you go to school more, you have a higher income. But also, they were trying to see if white people benefited more from this, right? And they did find it was significant 0.05 that white people benefited more from education. But again, 0.05, like at that point it's just p-hacking, right? Where if you get like all these different correlations and only one of them is positive and in the right direction, like, you don't really care about that. Unless it's 0.01, then it matters. But 0.05 is pretty much useless in this case. But let's assume it was significant, right? This would still have the issue from before, right? Which is that black people in school, obviously had lower IQs, right? So education reflected less of an IQ, I guess it was less of an indicator of intelligence, is what I'll say for black people and white people, right? So obviously that would cause this difference to happen. But then if you look at the bottom of the table, this is weekly labor income. So if you're looking specifically at those in the labor force, and the fifth model, again, this time it's positive, but look, it's 0.001 in the Poisson regression, so it doesn't matter, and it's insignificant. And then if you look at the next column, it's negative again, right? This time it's significant at 0.05 again, and it's twice as negative. And then years of schooling, sorry, we don't care about that. So white 1940 x years of schooling, right? Once again, the effect that being white has in the returns from schooling. It's significant 0.01. So this time you do kind of care about it, right? But it's still like again that could be explained by different things, right? Where returns on schooling school isn't education is less of an indicator of intelligence among black people as white people. And again, you would have to, not again, I haven't explained this. So the reason for this, for white people would be, is because white people obviously go to different colleges, right? So they're probably more selective at those colleges. So if people think that you're white, right, then they'll be more likely to, then you'll have to compete with other whites to get into that education, right? But then if you're black, you'll compete with other blacks, right? And those schools probably, need more people in them, right? So they need to, be less restrictive on who can go. So even though these people aren't actually white, this would still apply to them because they're perceived as white, right? If that makes sense. And of course, the authors use this, terrible, terrible stuff, terrible statistics, right, to conclude that blacks earn more if they pass as white. But their data obviously contradicts this, right? If you examine it without being, retarded, right? And then that's basically it. There's a conflict of interest slide, but it doesn't really matter at all. And then here's the sources.